Today on The State of Us, the bipartisan gun bill has cleared an initial vote in the Senate. Will it matter? Welcome to The State of Us. I'm your host, Justin T. Weller, joined, of course, today by Mr. Lance L. Jackson, our senior historian here at True Chat, and also lovingly known as the Friendly Redneck Liberal. Today, we're talking about the 80-page bill called the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, how it would enhance background checks, give authorities up to 10 business days to review the juvenile and mental health records of gun purchasers younger than 21, and direct millions of dollars toward helping states implement so-called red flag laws, which allow authorities to temporarily confiscate guns from people deemed dangerous, as well as other intervention programs. It would also, for the first time, ensure that serious dating partners are included in a federal law that bars domestic abusers from purchasing firearms, a long-time priority that has eluded gun safety advocates for years. All of that according to an article in the New York Times. The vote 64-34 came just hours after Republicans and Democrats released the text of the legislation. We've got a lot to talk about today, not just the legislation itself, but also some important other data about who stops a bad guy with a gun and the mass shootings where stricter gun laws might have had a difference. So plenty to dive into, but do we have a word of the day, Lance?
We do, and I think it's irrefragable that we do something about this. The problem is that we as Americans don't agree on what it is that should be done, but we all agree that it should be done. Irrefragable. It is 5 syllables, IRREFRAGABLE, means that which cannot be refuted or indisputable. So irrefragable. So, where do we go? Everybody, I don't know too many people. Actually, I don't know anyone who said, oh, wow, I'm really happy that these shootings are taking place, that, these people are being killed in these mass shootings. Nobody's saying that. And we all have, unfortunately, though, different opinions on how to get there. And the question is, if we do something, is it really going to make a difference no matter what we decide to do? And that's what worries me, is that the politicians are going to sign off on something and hold it up and say, hey, look, bipartisan legislation, we got something done. But if it doesn't make any difference, is it just a blank show of solidarity that does us no good?
So I think the way we're going to approach this is tell you a little bit about what the law actually is as it looks right now, but keeping in mind that will likely shift a little bit. And then we're going to give you some data in the middle of the show, and then hopefully try to end out by talking about, so should this legislation actually be advanced? Is it actually a good thing? Senator Mitch McConnell called the bill, quote, a common sense package of popular steps that will help make these horrifying incidents less likely while fully upholding the Second Amendment rights of law-abiding citizens, end quote. And Senator Chuck Schumer, so you've got the leading Republican, Senator Mitch McConnell, and the leading Democrat, Senator Chuck Schumer, saying, quote, this bipartisan gun safety legislation is progress and will save lives. While it is not everything we want, this legislation is urgently needed. So one of the things that comes with this, we already talked about a few of the items, Lance, enhancing background checks, right? Giving authorities up to 10 business days to review the juvenile and mental health records of gun purchasers who are under the age of 21, and direct a lot of money toward helping states implement red flag laws as well as other intervention programs. We'll talk about those in a second, but let's look at the first ones. I mean, I think something that's been discussed for a while, right, is the background check thing. You have to get a background check in certain places, but not in other places. And that seems like a very flagrant loophole that necessarily, if changed, should produce some degree of improvement. No?
Yes. I'm frustrated because I think people are going to look at this and say, oh, no, it's never going to happen again. No, it's going to. Okay. We are not taking any kind of hard stance, and even the hardest stance you could take doesn't mean it's going to stop it. And it's just so frustrating that we have this divide in our country today that people then want to react violently to try to solve. And it just seems, and it says so in some of the articles that we've read for today's show, it is happening more and more. I mean, it's doubled, I think, in the last 5 years. It's gone from something like 29, 30, 31 to more than 60 last year. And I'm all for doing something that's going to slow this down, maybe reverse the trend. But I think too many of us are out there looking for the panacea that will stop it altogether. And the systemic problem is deeper than that. There's not just one law or 5 laws that can be passed. And then I can say, you know what? I'm going to be safe when I walk into the supermarket. My children are going to be safe when I drop them off at school. This isn't going to happen here. We're living in a time because of other issues that I'm not sure Congress can settle. They can help, and that's what they're saying, right? That's what both Mitch McConnell and Schumer said, is that this will help. It will make it better. Okay, folks, read between the lines. They're not telling you it's going to stop. And I think people, the next time it happens, are going to say, well, see, we passed these laws and it didn't stop it. They're telling you it's not going to stop it. They're trying to improve it incrementally.
And that's what the theme.
And that's frustrating to me, okay? That's just frustrating to me. And I'm not sure that I have the answers. I do think I have some solutions that would do a better job. But again, we can't get all members of our society. We can't get a majority of our society or a majority of our elected officials to agree to put some of these in place.
So, and I think that's the theme through a lot of the legislation, is a lot of these concepts are not novel, right? Broadening background checks, closing the, so-called boyfriend loophole, which is basically this notion that the current law only bars domestic abusers who have been married to or have lived with the victim or have had a child with them from buying a firearm. Lawmakers are expanding the definition to include a current or recent former dating relationship with the victim. Again, a lot of these things aren't novel. They're not like super radical. They are lots of things that have been allowed to prevail for a long time, that I think the way to look at a lot of this is it cleans up a lot of things that previously are like, why is it this way? Like, for example, why are a large portion of sales not subject to background checks? That doesn't, if we make them mandated over here, why are they not mandated over here? Lots of basic, I guess, is the way that I look at it. Lots of basic things that were left out because of policy making, either simply being, inadequate or because lobbyists help get things changed. Whatever the reason, there's been some large loopholes in our laws, and some of the laws arguably would certainly be more effective if some of these big gaps didn't exist. To Lance's point, even gun advocates would say there's really nothing that is 100% effective. I mean, you're probably never going to eliminate the problem altogether.
Well, and I don't want to be hypocritical because I've yelled from the mountaintops on this forum that I've been given that if we can agree, if our legislators can agree on something, then let's take it, even if it is incremental change. So yes, that they can agree on something like, universal background checks in every state or in all situations. That's a plus. That's a move forward. Let's get it signed and let's put it into effect. And hopefully the humans that enforce the law will actually do their job and enforce it correctly. So I don't want to sound like, well, it's too late. There's nothing to do. I just want to put, it's nice that we can find some common ground here because that's what we advocate all the time. But people need to slow it down a little bit if they think we're going to get something that's going to stop all these things entirely.
Yeah, I think it's it's very important to understand that I don't think that anybody who is Republican or Democrat who's advocating for this is suggesting that this is the fix-all. It is a step, and a step is more than we've gotten previously. So we're going to talk more, though, about, you may be able to already draw some conclusions about, do we think the legislation will really make a difference, and also should we do it? But before we get to that, there's two other articles that we've linked at thestateofus.org that I think are very illuminating just about the data of the situation, right? Regardless of where you come down on, who should have guns and how easy it should be to have access to them, I think anytime that we're going to craft, legislation or say, let's do this thing as a policy, very important, I think, to have a good understanding of how do the shootings end, right? How do they start? How do they end? And then what do we want to do about those things? So this particular article looks at who stops a bad guy with a gun. There were at least 433 active shooter attacks, which is defined as one or more shooters killed or attempted to kill multiple unrelated people in a populated area. There were 433 of those in the United States from the year 2000 to 2021. The country experienced an average of more than one a week in 2021 alone. So, what do we know about this data? Well, if you're like me and you like charts, then I think you should definitely go read the article itself, because it's got a handful of charts. But basically what it does here for us is it breaks down the 433 active shooting attacks into two main categories. The first one, 249 attacks that ended before the police arrived. So the majority of shooting attacks end before the police actually get on site. And then the second big chunk is 184 attacks that ended after the police arrived. So in both cases, we get to look at, how did things end? Did the shooter leave the scene? Did they die by suicide? Did bystanders intervene? Did they subdue them? Did they shoot them? When the police got involved, how did it end? So we're going to look at all of that data, and I want you to think about here, Lance, while we go to break. I'm hoping our listeners give some consideration to, how do you think most of these ended? What do you think the standout item was? Well, we're going to look at that. We're going to look at what the data tells us. So keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back. $433 active shooter attacks in the United States from 2000 to 2021. How did those attacks end? Well, let's look at some of the breakdown. Police officers shoot or physically subdue the shooter in less than a third of all attacks. So again, we talked about these are broken down into two groups. In 184 of the 433, attacks ended after police arrived. In 131 of those attacks, the police shot the attacker 98 times and subdued the attacker 33 times. So police officers shoot or physically subdue the shooter in less than a third of all attacks, Lance.
Well, that's why Senator Ted Cruz said after the Uvalde shooting, what stops armed bad guys is armed good guys. Let's just get more guns out there, right?
We have some data on that.
The very fact that this is what just astounded me, and I don't remember which article it was in, but there are more guns in the United States than there are people.
Yep.
Yet we know that there is a segment of our society that doesn't believe in any guns. So that means, and again, I know you don't like it when I do this, but if you draw the arrows, that means the people who own guns must have multiple guns. I mean, that's,
That is true. I mean, just statistically, if you look at the data,
is that irrefragable that most people who own guns own more than one? I mean, they would have to, because I can think of the 4 members in my household, and we own none. So somebody's making up the difference for us not owning any.
So
at least at this point, that's
three
if,
in
if
10.
Senator Ted Cruz is right and we're all just going to become in the Wild West, I guess I'm going to have to strap on a gun, right?
So 3 in 10 U.S. adults say they own a gun, and 4 in 10 U.S. adults say they live in a household with a gun.
But there are more guns than there are people in the United States. Okay. Just point that out, folks. Just trying to point out the facts.
Yep. So what it tells us is that in most cases, the likelihood is that if you own one, you probably own more than one.
But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's the way these mass shooting attacks end.
So bystanders stop some attackers, but it's more often with physical force than with a gun. So of the 249 attacks that ended before the police arrived, in 64 of those instances, a bystander ended the altercation. Of those 64, 42 times they subdued the attacker by means other than shooting them, other than with a gun, And then in 22 instances, a bystander shot the attacker. And I think the thing that's even a little more interesting there is they go even further to break down. So in those 22 times over the last 20 plus years where a bystander with a gun shot somebody, who was it that actually did the shooting, right? In those 22 instances. Well, 10 of those were either security guards or off-duty police officers, and 12 of them were private citizens. So I don't know. I mean, yes, you could say, 64, bystanders. Well, only 22 of them used a gun. And of those that used a gun, 10 of them were professionals who were trained. I mean, arguably, obviously, the security guards were their job at that moment was literally to do what they did. And the off-duty police officers obviously were trained individuals who intervened, even though they weren't, quote unquote, on duty.
But that's about 25% of attacks that ended before the police arrived. So how do most attacks end before the police arrived? Well, in 185 cases, 113 times, the attacker left the scene. Now, many times to be arrested later by the police, but 113 times when the police didn't show up before the attack ended, the shooter just left.
Yep.
And 72 times they turned their weapon on themselves and committed suicide. So, rhetorical question here. Does putting more guns on the street in the hands of the good guys, is it going to stop shooters, mass shootings?
Well, there's already a lot of guns.
Is it going to? Because obviously there's a lot of guns on the street already, because there's more than one for each of us out there.
So 1 in 4, the two most common ways attacks ends all told. So not just we're now combining the two categories, right? So attacks that end before police arrive and after. Of the 433 active shooter attacks since the year 2000, 1 in 4 attacks, 25%, end in a shooter suicide. Also, 1 in 4 attackers leave the scene, though the majority are later apprehended. Those are the two most common ways that these situations end, are either the person kills themselves, regardless of, police arrive or not. And then the other most common item is that they leave, they get away. Now, when I say they get away, they temporarily get away. Most of the time they are, later caught. So,
well, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but like the Parkland high school shooter, walked to Walmart and got a Coke and then went to McDonald's and then was arrested there. So they didn't do further harm, but they walked away, because they put down their gun and walked out with the students who were trying to escape the shooter and just pretended to be one of the students and walked by police and then had to be apprehended later.
So that's kind of the data breakdown. Again, visually, if you need to see it to better understand it, it is linked. But it does give us a good idea of how do attacks end, what brings them to conclusions currently or historically, which then may also tell us some about, well, where should we be investing,
Well, and these numbers, right, are from since Columbine in 1999.
So these
right,
ones,
does it
2000
since 2000?
Yes. Now the other data that we're looking at,
it's not that it didn't happen before 2000. It's just
right,
that this report is from 2000 to the present,
to 2021. So it doesn't include anything in 2022 either. Now this next set of data that we're looking at, transitioning here a little bit, it's entitled "The Mass Shootings Where Stricter Gun Laws Might Have Made a Difference." Now this one goes back to 1999, so 1 year earlier.
But both of them are similar time frames. They're not.
Yes.
They're not including anything that happened really before
99. No.
99.
No.
Okay.
So here's how this article opens, and again, linked at thestateofus.org. If the key gun control proposals now being considered in Congress had been law since 1999, 4 gunmen younger than 21 would have been blocked from legally buying the rifles they used in mass shootings. At least 4 other assailants would have been subject to a required background check instead of slipping through a loophole. 10 might have been unable to steal their weapons because of efforts to require or encourage safer gun storage. And 20 might not have been allowed to legally purchase the large capacity magazines that they use to upgrade their guns, helping them kill on average 16 people apiece. Taken together, those 4 measures that I just mentioned might have changed the course of at least 35 mass shootings. A third of such episodes in the United States since the massacre of Columbine High School in Colorado, a New York Times analysis has found. Those 35 shootings killed a combined 446 people. So, the article goes on to point out, and I think this is, again, it's important to say, no law would be guaranteed to stop any one shooting. And America already has more guns than people, leaving a motivated individual with numerous paths to violence. But after recent massacres in Texas and New York State, which authorities said were committed by 18-year-old men who legally bought military-style rifles, Democrats have made emotional appeals to advance gun control legislation. And now, obviously, as we mentioned at the beginning of the show, bipartisan efforts are underway to actually put something forward. So what exactly would be different in these cases? I mean, why would things change? This is a Times analysis, and they used a database of mass shootings kept by the Violence Project, which is a nonprofit group that has collected information about shootings in public places that have killed 4 or more people, not including the gunman. Okay, so that's how this article and that database define mass shootings. The database was last updated after the shooting in Buffalo, and the Times added the more recent Texas shooting. So it covers all of that data. The Times accounting is very conservative. The current proposal on large capacity magazines in Congress would ban all that hold more than 10 bullets. The database defined extended capacity magazines as ones where the gun's standard magazine had been replaced with a larger one. If the standard magazine came with 30 bullets, for example, and was not replaced, it was not counted. The data also doesn't have every detail about every shooting. So just that disclaimer about this is what we know. This is a conservative measure of looking at, the very largest of large ones. And also important to know that mass shootings account for a very tiny share of the roughly 100 Americans who die on average every day from gun violence. Researchers say many of the measures under discussion to prevent mass shootings would also reduce other gun violence, including suicides. Because mass shootings are much rarer than other forms of gun violence, making them hard to study, and some policies will never be easy to evaluate if they are not actually tried in the first place. So there's a lot of different proposals here, Lance. We picked out just a few. We'll quickly run through some of them. Raising the minimum age to purchase certain guns to 21. 4 gunmen were under the age of 21 and purchased their weapons legally. The proposal is in the House and would raise the minimum gun purchasing age to 21 for more weapons, but not all. 18-year-olds would still be able to buy hunting rifles. The House is expected to pass the measure. It does not appear to be the subject of current negotiations among senators, though, based on what we've already read. Republicans have called the provision unconstitutional, pointing to a recent ruling by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. The analysis shows that most mass shooters in the database who legally purchased their guns were older than 21, but 4 of the gunmen might have been stymied by such a law. So age-based restrictions may limit gun violence more generally, evidence suggests, even if they may not have prevented many mass shootings.
I have a hard time with choosing the age. If we say that you're a citizen at 18, then shouldn't you have all rights? I mean, we allow people to vote. We make them serve in the military if we have a draft. I have a hard time.
But you don't drink and you don't gamble.
And I have a hard time with that.
Sure, we've talked about that.
I mean,
before.
I have a hard time with those kinds of things where you have limited citizenship, because the argument is, well, you know, the human brain is not fully developed yet. And so that's why we do this and we do that. And okay, then make it across the board. And I guess that's my take. I'm not saying I'm right. I have a problem with that. Now, does that mean I think anybody should be allowed to buy some of these weapons? That's where I think this legislation falls short. Does it help? Again, like I said in the first segment, if it's going to help stop one, then it's a good thing. If we can agree on it as a majority of legislators and states, and we can agree on it and we can put it in and it stops 1 or 2 shootings, then it's worth the trouble.
It varies a lot. And I think the data, obviously, that's part of what the article points out is it could make a difference in terms of how much of a difference.
And if it stops 1 shooting and it saves 1 life, it's worth it. Pass it. You know what I'm saying? I mean, I'm not against passing it. But you asked me specifically about the age restriction part of it. And I can see where that is good, but I can also see where it's good maybe to raise the age for other things as well.
Yeah.
But we don't do that, right? So I have trouble with the inconsistency there.
A number of other items: expanding background checks, banning the sale of large capacity magazines, storage requirements. We've got more to talk about. Keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back. Expanding background checks to cover private sales. At least 4 attackers purchased a weapon from a private seller in a state where background checks were not required for such sales. President Biden's endorsed this House bill. A bipartisan group of senators is discussing the possible background check bill.
I don't understand why you're against this, right? Those of you, and email us at thestateofus.org. I don't understand why you're against background checks. I don't understand. Nobody's stopping you from buying the weapon that you want. Unless, of course, the background check shows that there's some reason why you shouldn't have it. So I don't understand how this violates anybody's interpretation of the Second Amendment of the Constitution. To me, this is a no-brainer, right?
I mean, a background check to get a gun's easier than getting a license to drive a car, right? So I guess the point here is that to say that this, unnecessarily limits you, I think that's a bit of a stretch, given that, again, the burden to driving a car is higher than it is to owning a gun. And even doing this won't make that higher. It'll just make it uniform. We already say background checks are important. If they're important, then they should just be required. Another simple one, I think, encouraging safe gun storage and punishing people who fail to secure guns from children and criminals. 10% of shootings involved a stolen gun. That is a bad reason, for something to happen.
See, I think this is huge because you and I were talking about this. You say, oh, and you just kind of pass it off. But I think this is huge because we were talking off air how, the human brain does so many things on impulse. And if you can just stop that impulse and cause somebody just to slow down for a second.
Pause.
I mean, how many times do you do that as a parent with your children? Or for me as a former school teacher with young people, just like, whoa, slow down, take a deep breath. And if you can get them to do that, then all of a sudden their demeanor starts to change. So I don't understand, why and I was around that. My uncles were hunters and they all had a gun rack in their home, in their living room to display all of their shotguns and everything else. But you know what? It was always under lock and key. The cabinet was under lock and key, and then there were locks on each one of the weapons. So even though as you're sitting there having a cup of coffee with them, you can see their arsenal, it's all under lock and key. It's all locked. I would never leave a gun laying around the house unlocked. They were adamant about that. It was part of gun safety.
And I can speak to obviously members of my family that do practice that. And I think that's the message is obviously there's a lot of gun owners out there who do that, who are serious about the safety and securing the weapons. But the point is that there's nothing that...
If you're not going to be, shouldn't you be punished?
Right.
If you're not going to take care of something that you have that can cause harm to others, if you're not going to take the proper care of it, shouldn't you be punished if someone is injured or killed with the use of your weapon?
The other one, this has been talked about a lot, probably less likely, substantially less likely, is banning the sale of large capacity magazines. Extended magazines were used in a fifth of shootings. At least 19% of all shootings in the database involved assailants who upgraded their guns with magazines that were larger than those that came standard with their weapons, including several with the largest death counts.
If you're target shooting, explain this to me, will you? If you're target shooting or you're hunting, you don't use an automatic weapon. There's no need for it. I don't understand, again, why this is unconstitutional. I don't understand how this steps on your rights as a legitimate gun owner who wants to protect themselves, wants to hunt, or wants to target shoot. Why do you need the ability to pull off multiple rounds in seconds?
So interestingly, because we talk about that a lot, people hunting or sport, but personal protection is actually the reason that tops the list of why gun owners say they own a firearm.
I can see that. I understand that.
And considerably smaller shares gave other reasons. Only 40% of people that own a gun say it's for hunting. Non-specific recreation or sport use is only 11% of all gun ownership. The gun is an antique or family heirloom, 6%, or the gun is related to their line of work, 5%. The majority of everybody that owns a gun says that it's for personal protection. Hunting, sport, those are actually smaller, percentages.
But in any of those situations, even for protection, why is it necessary to hold the trigger and be able to shoot off? I don't even know how many rounds. And
30 rounds, I
don't understand that.
Yeah.
You can protect yourself with something.
Well, I guess the
thinking
here is that if you need 30 rounds to protect yourself, you're either not very well trained with the gun because, your aim's not going to be very good, or there's a lot of freaking people after you for some reason.
Exactly. Right?
Which doesn't mean that you're in the wrong, but what type of situation have we gotten into where, you're going to need that kind of firepower? I think that's the common sense side of this, right? Is, again, if somebody breaks into your home and okay, I have a handgun and it's got 6 rounds in it, I probably can take care of the one person. But do I need 30 rounds? That's, again, So the end of it is, should the legislation that's before the Senate move forward, expanding red flag laws in 46% of shootings, an attacker expressed interest in harming others. In 36%, at least one attacker was previously known to be suicidal. So mental health is a big part of this. I don't know how many times we've said that. I mean, again, a quarter of all attacks end in the shooter killing themselves. So obviously mental health is a big deal. Mental health money is a big part of this legislation. It includes $60 million over 5 years to provide mental health and behavioral health training for primary care clinics, $150 million to support the National Suicide Prevention Hotline, $240 million over 4 years for Project Aware, a program that focuses on mental health support for school children, and $28 million of which is set aside for trauma care in schools. So not only does it contain changes to our laws, but it also goes to try to better fund mental health initiatives. To say that all mass shootings, are solvable through mental health, I think is not necessarily a good way to look at it. To not address that would be foolish. To not address the legislative side would also be foolish. So I think a thing that I appreciate about this legislation is that it is actually attempting to look at both of those things. My feelings are summed up, I guess, fairly well, Lance, by what Derek Johnson, the president of the NAACP, said about this legislation in the Senate right now. When school children, churchgoers, and grocery store shoppers are being gunned down, the perfect cannot be the enemy of the good. It is frustrating. I think Americans have expressed that it is frustrating. I think we need to take what's before us. A step is certainly in this case better than nothing. To Lance's point, if this stops a shooting and people don't die, then wasn't this worth doing? It seems like it.
I agree with that. Something is better than nothing. Just don't get your hopes up that this solves all the problems.
So, Lance, why do we have this conversation today? What was the point?
Well, the point is here at True Chat, we have a mission, and our mission is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. And I think we've done that today, and we've asked you to chime in and let us know what your thoughts are. And if you can give us different insight, we'd be glad to read it and share it with our audience as well. And hopefully this starts conversations where you are in your home or workplace. And if it does, and people say, well, this is good stuff, tell them they can find us as a podcast on Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, and everywhere podcasts are found. And I think it's irrefragable that I win today. Just wanted to get that in.
Indeed. I'll concede that is an irrefutable reality. The State of Us is available Tuesdays and Thursdays as a podcast. First thing in the mornings, we're heard on the weekends on AM and FM radio stations across the country. For The State of Us, I'm Justin T. Weller.
I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to Bradley Butcher, our producer. Thank you all, our audience, for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.